My name's Fraser Scarp. I'm head of the postgraduate programme at the Royal Drawing School. And I'm so delighted to be joined by Barbara Paca this evening and Claire Gilman. We're going to be talking about Frank Walter, an incredible artist who produced over 5,000 paintings, 1,000 drawings, 600 sculptures, an incredible body of work and an incredible life. And I'm really excited to hear more about Frank's life and work tonight. Just to introduce our speakers this evening, Barbara Paca is an art historian and landscape architect with a PhD from Princeton University, as well as many postdoctoral fellowships. She's the author of Frank Walter, The Last Universal Man, which came out in 2017, and also Ruth Starr Rose, Revelations of African American Life in Maryland and the World, which came out in 2015, and the Frank Walter Catalogue for the 2013 Art Basel at Miami Beach. She's also editor of Environmental Justice as a Civil Right, the National Pavilion Catalogue for Antigua and Barbuda, and the Venice Biennale 2018. She's currently serving as cultural envoy to Antigua and Barbuda and is the curator for Antigua and Barbuda's National Pavilion at the Venice Biennale as well. And she was recognized with an OBE in 2018 for lifetime achievement in historic preservation and the protection of intangible cultural heritage. So thank you for joining us, Barbara. And Claire Gilman is the chief curator at the Drawing Center in New York. And over the past 13 years, she's overseen the museum's curatorial program, organized over 50 exhibitions and public programs, and authored numerous catalogues. Gilman holds a PhD from Columbia University and has taught art history and critical theory at a wide range of institutions, in addition to lecturing on modern and contemporary art throughout the country and overseas. And her book, Drawing in the Present Tense, co-authored with Roger Malbert, was recently published by Thames and Hudson. So thank you so much both for joining us tonight. I think, Claire, you're in New York. Yeah. Oh, sorry, you're just on mute at the moment.
Sorry. Yes, I am in New York. So very
You're in
happy
New
to
York.
join you all from New York.
Thank you. And Barbara, you're charging somewhere in New Jersey.
Yes, I am. I'm en route from teaching at an historically Black college and university in Baltimore called Morgan State to a private client in Connecticut. So yes, I am. And it's an honor to be here. And thank you for your brilliant introduction, Fraser.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We're going to hear from both Claire and Barbara this evening. And I should say that there will be some time throughout and at the end of the conversation for some questions. So if you do have anything you'd like to ask, we've got a Q&A and a chat box, which you can enter questions into, and we'll try and feed those in as we're going, and also have some time at the end for any further questions, which I'm sure Claire and Barbara will be happy to hear. Just to start things off, Barbara, I think we currently have a show of Frank's work at the Garden Museum in London at the moment, which actually ends in 3 days' time. So there'll hopefully be a sort of surge post this chat tonight of people going to see that. So not too much longer to see it, but I think really incredible to see work in the flesh. And I was hoping you could maybe just give our audience a bit of an introduction to Frank for any who are unfamiliar with his work and his world. And then I thought it'd be wonderful to hear from you both how you each came to know Frank's work in the first instance. And Barbara, what sparked your relationship with Frank and his family and the important work you've been doing to protect his legacy. And then Claire, your involvement with Frank's work and the upcoming show at the Drawing Center.
I think Hans Ulrich Obrist, when he saw our pavilion in 2017, he said, "Oh my gosh, this is the Leonardo da Vinci of Antigua." You know, Claire and I are going to tell you a lot about Frank Walter in the next hour, which we really hope is kind of a conversation. And one of the things that Claire and I share is a deep belief in human potential, people realizing their potential and finding genius in surprising places. So I think Frank Walter for Claire and myself really he's a revelation. He's so inspiring. And he is universal, his work.
Hmm. Hmm. And of
Yeah.
course, Frank was born in 1926 in Antigua, Barbara, if I'm right, and his story is really quite an incredible one. And the sort of ambition and the scope of his work is pretty wide ranging, and I think we'll see and hear examples of that tonight. How did you first come? How were you first introduced to Frank?
It was quite by accident. I saw his work in a house, and later that afternoon, I was called in. It's a very private beach that I was on, and a woman called me in. And I had a very small baby at the time, and she said, I had to call you in because you look exactly like a black man that I know. And my friend, who was at the Rhode Island School of Design, thought, oh, Barbara's going to slaughter this woman. But I was kind of curious, and she said, oh, his name is Jules Walter. He plays he plays African ambassadors and assassins in James Bond movies. So that was supposed to make me feel better, I guess. But I recognized the surname. I gave her my card and asked him to call me, and he called within an hour and invited me to a party. I went with a friend, and it just began. I said, look, I'm really sorry. I never met I guess Frank Walter was your relation. I understand he's no longer living. And he said, don't be ridiculous. And he took me up to meet Frank. So it changed my whole life. And there hasn't been a day that goes by where I don't honor the memory of Frank Walter. And his family's it's been in Idyll for 20 years now. So feel very lucky, and I feel very fortunate to have had the experience with all the incredible talent at the Garden Museum, and now to be working with Claire Gilman and her gifted team of committed people at the Drawing Center in New York. So
Wonderful. And Claire, how did you first come to be aware of Frank's work?
Yes. So I, sadly, I did not have the privilege to meet Frank in the flesh, but I feel that I've gotten to know him through his work, and also through Barbara, who I really think is just a champion for him, for his work, but also for his spirit. And I do think you can sense Frank's spirit in his work. So you can get to know him in a way when you become deeply immersed in his work. But I first saw the work at that Venice Biennale, which I guess was in 2017. You just said, Barbara. I couldn't remember if it was 2017 or 2019. But it was the Antigua and Barbuda Pavilion that Barbara put on, which was off-site. And I had heard a lot about it. So I think a lot of people, I mean, there were a number of us who discovered Frank at that time. And the word was going around, you have to see this pavilion, make sure you don't miss the Antigua and Barbuda Pavilion. So I made sure I got there, and it was indeed, it was absolutely a revelation. And it was such an incredible installation that Barbara put together. So you got a sense of, I think, the full scope of Frank's production, as well as, sort of how he lived. And there was a lot of his work, but there were also elements of his life, as I recall, and there was also video footage, I think, and there were some his manuscripts. So you got a sense that this was an entire life, and that Frank as an artist was more than simply the individual works that he produced. It was his entire life, in a certain sense, I think, was a work of art, was a work of creation or creativity. I mean, I think he lived his life as a creator. You sense that in his writing, that is how he approached the world. And so that was when I first saw his work. I was absolutely blown away and kind of stored it in the back of my mind. I guess I was at the Drawing Center at the time, but it wasn't, it was just sort of in my head. And then I think I actually saw Hilton Alls had curated a group show at Karma, and he included 2 or 3 really small Frank works in that show. And I remember seeing those, and it kind of jogged my memory. So I guess that was probably about 3 years ago or something like that, or maybe a little more than that. he came back sort of into my mind, and I thought, oh, Frank, yes, Frank, we need to do something with Frank. So it turned out, actually, I spoke to our executive director. It was actually really funny. We were talking about, we always sort of brainstorm about future shows at the Drawing Center. And I said, well, and we were talking about, I don't know how we'd circled on this, but I said, well, how about Frank Walter? And just as I said that, Laura had gone behind to reach for the postcard from the Antigua and Barbuda Pavilion, which she had kept all these years. So in this moment, we both had this sense that, this was the right thing to do. And so that was it. And then from that moment on, I kind of worked towards putting together this show, and knew that he had done something at David Zwirner at that time. So I think David Zwirner, or James Green at David Zwirner, put me in touch with Barbara. And that was when I started doing my deep dive into Frank.
Wonderful. I mean, that Venice Pavilion sounds like such a wonderful introduction and such an immersive world. It sounds so brilliant. And we're going to see some images later, Claire, from you, which will give us a sort of taste of that upcoming show. And it'd be really interesting to hear about the process involved in bringing those works together and thinking about that show and how best to present those works. So we look forward to seeing those later. But Barbara, I'm going to share my screen now, and we've got some fantastic slides, which I think will give the audience a great sort of insight into Frank's world. And I'm going to move through these, but I wonder if you'd be sort of happy to sort of expand then on this first meeting with Frank and how you became part of this world.
Well, Fraser, thank you so much. And you can go through at a pretty healthy gallop, because I want to have time for the guests on this call to also take part. So this is Frank Walter's now 95-year-old relation, Jules, who I was compared to, seeing the exhibition for the first time. He lives in London and he lives in Antigua. And the designer, Jeremy Herbert, did a brilliant job of bringing you into Frank's world. So you can just keep on going to the next one. Yeah, and this is just showing part of the interior installation, which is Frank's environment, a place called Rendezvous Bay. So I think if you go to the next, this is just Jules in the space. So Jeremy Herbert, we wanted, as with Venice, where we had absolutely zero budget, but a lot of love, we wanted to bring you into Frank's environment. So this image that you have here, you can see there's a photograph of Frank in his studio with his sculpture, which was very personal, very private. He never sold it. It was sort of talismanic. And you can see how we recreated that setting on the right-hand side. Jules is looking in the case, and then you see a beautiful black and white photograph of Jules and Frank as young plantation managers. So you can see a picture of then Prince Charles, which was in the vestibule of Frank's home. That picture with a handmade frame by Frank, of which we have 2,000 of these incredibly beautiful handmade frames, was the first thing you saw when you came into Frank's home. So again, this is just part of the labor of love, was working with the family to understand Frank's story. That's sifting through the 50,000 page archive, which we've now digitized and conserved, and asking Frank questions about his artwork. It was, I think with older people, it's a very helpful thing for them to be organized by seeing their family members and kind of going through questions and answers, which we used art as a vehicle for helping him to remain organized. So the wonderful artist Josh Smith, about whom Claire will speak later, was recently at Frank Walter's house with other people who are involved in the Drawing Center exhibition. And he just said, this house is incredible. It was calibrated for one person. And it's like a religious experience to be there. So you can see there's the photograph of the then prince in Frank's front hall with artwork. The gentleman on the left-hand side I'm speaking to is his elder relation, who's a man called Mr. Brown, who was one of 3 organic farmers. Frank lived in complete isolation without the disruption of electricity and running water, as did his relation, Mr. Brown. They were organic farmers, and they all recognized that this monastic life, very close to nature, was the most privileged existence they could have. So the family went up and helped keep an eye on everyone and make sure they had what they needed. So again, this is just one of the times. Yes, now this is the first day on the left. That's Jules when he taken me up to meet Frank, and you can see Frank is wearing this incredible curtain, which we conserved and it's used in the exhibition. He's using a shovel as his kind of walking stick. And he and Jules engaged in a conversation in Latin for about 5 minutes before we were invited in. So it's just wonderfully eccentric.
And Barbara, just to rewind to that very first meeting and that party when you first met Frank. I mean, what year was it? How old was Frank when you first met him?
So 2003. That's a good question. He must have been about 70 years old. And the party that Jules had the most elegant friends, and it was like Federico Fellini meets Spike Lee, the people at his parties. So he just said, "We're leaving this party. I'm taking you up a hill." And I had no idea what he was talking about, because we were told that Frank Walter was dead by people who weren't particularly respectful. And suddenly we're driving on a road, and I think I'm going to die because this isn't really a road. And finally we stop the vehicle and we hike up and engage with Frank. So it was just a complete shock to my system. And when I met Frank, I had been at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton when John Nash was there. I was at the university when he was there. And when I met Frank Walter, it was like meeting John Nash. I mean, he clearly was a person of extreme brilliance and very independent and very pure soul.
And how quickly did you become sort of absorbed by his world and sort of begin this incredible journey to work to preserve his legacy and to work with his family? Was it an instant thing for you? Or?
Oh, for me, it was intellectual love at first sight, but I just didn't, I just didn't know what to do. I just witnessed this whole exchange happening, and Frank asked me questions and I answered them. And every artist I've met who knew Frank Walter says the same thing. When they met Frank, they were the only person in the room, and he made you feel that way. He wanted to know about you. The other curious thing that many artists tell me is that they were at a kind of crossroads in their life, and that Frank Walter asked the questions and kind of enjoyed listening to them and help them figure out what would turn out to be the best next steps for them. So it was a religious experience. I came back down the hill to Jules's house, which is called La Boheme. I mean, it's this wonderful kind of Antiguan palace on stilts with these incredibly elegant people. And I was taken downstairs to a little chamber where there was a tiny little phone and this kind of crackling line, a man who I later found out was the brother of the prime minister and the minister of economic development and tourism, and a brilliant journalist called Sir Selwyn Walter, asked me about meeting Frank, and just very simple questions I tried to answer directly. And then he asked me if I would be willing to take on the intricate vulnerability of Frank's mind. And again, without hesitation, it was yes. And the family, it's been 20 years of just mutual respect and kind of an excitement as we've learned more and more about Frank Walter together.
It's such a wonderful story and introduction to Frank. And I mean, did you feel that you had to tread carefully at the start? I mean, were you were sort of welcomed straight away, or it's
I
quite
was
an undertaking.
welcome, but it was such a big responsibility. So these are maps. One of the first things we learned when we were completely, our pavilion was done on a shoestring. The Governor General's a doctor. He wanted the first artist from Antigua, that was our inaugural national pavilion, to be a person of perceived mental challenges, a person of great genius. He needed the pavilion to be completely accessible, and he believed that accessibility was economic accessibility. So we needed to be free, where Arsenale charges a fee. And so we found an incredible place in our monastery, but we still knew we had to have maps. We made an Antiguan garden. We told people, come here, sit down, have your lunch. We had benches in the space because Venice doesn't really invite people to sit. And we were completely unplugged, but it was trying to bring people into Frank's world. So these are really beautiful images of Frank Walter is on the far left. The day that he left for England, he was the first person of color to be a manager on the island of Antigua, and his fate was to manage a sugar plantation, which he did very successfully for 5 years. This is the day in August of 1953 when he went to England with his cousin, the glamorous woman in the center. You can see Jules on the right, who's 3 years younger, and saying goodbye to them. So there's the first touristic film. Yeah. So this is when Frank arrives in London with his cousin and the love of his life, Eileen, though she had no idea he loved her. This gentleman you see in the picture on the right, Carl Walter, referred to as Uncle Carl, was known as the Black Prince of the West Indies. You see a photo of him on the left. He played the extra in Tarzan films, Korda films. And he took Eileen by the hand and said, you'll pass for white, but Frank won't. And he just left Frank standing in the middle of Tottenham Court Road. Frank told me the story 100 times. He never expressed any bitterness. Eileen ended up at Gray's Inn. She was the first woman of color to be a barrister from Antigua. She had a very successful career, lived to be 98, and was someone I interviewed and learned a lot from. So this is one of, if you're reading the text, one of Frank's descriptions of Uncle Carl Walter, who, by the way, ran the Caribbean Club in Denman Street in Piccadilly. So, he was this kind of incredibly sophisticated family. Yes, this is just a little bit about Jules, why I don't feel bad now that I was compared to him. He was a model, he was an actor, he was in the Star Wars film, and he also played Soubise in a British film that was banned, which is a shame because it was a film called Fight Against Slavery. It would have been the first film on slavery to come out, but Roots came out a year later, so America, as usual, will take credit for anything they can. But this is Jules playing Soubise, who was, of course, the lover of the Duchess of Devonshire. So at the time, it was thought that was a little too racy, so they banned it. And Jules is still alive and well. He holds court at the Garden Museum. He's a wonderful person.
That's so great.
So this is Sir Sullivan Walter and Lady Kathleen Walter, who have really been were really the people I relied upon most strongly to make sure that we were doing everything properly. So their collection of art exceeds that of the art museum in Antigua, and she's been an art educator for 45 years.
And just on that collection, Barbara, I mean, just looking, I've got a sort of a list here: 5,000 paintings, 1,000 drawings, 2,000 photographs. It's a huge output. I mean, where did you start?
With the family, and just very carefully, and we documented everything. We photographed everything. Frank in oh gosh, when was it? I think 2007 decided, who he wanted to have receive which pieces. So Sir Sullivan and Jules were really the people who negotiated. I followed their instructions. So it's a 50,000 page archive, which interested me greatly, and also 468 hours of his recorded voice, which I love Frank's art, and I'm fascinated by his mind. Again, it's a really complicated family story. So the first person, the patriarch of the family, was someone called John Jacob Walter. And you can see an image of him on the right with his wife, who's actually an African Swedish woman who was enslaved with their first daughter. So this is the earliest image we know of in Antigua of someone passing for white. I did the family genealogy for my godson, who's a member of this family. He's now 5, I think. And I traced them back to 1550 in Germany. So I went to the place in Germany where they came from, where there is a Walter Strasse. There are still members of the Walter family. And everyone, it all connected. And this isn't through just wishful thinking on ancestry. This is through birth certificates and records and wills. The image on the left of Lucilla Walter is another family story, and I don't discount it. Okay. Families are very complicated, and they claimed that they also descended from Lucy Walter, who was the mistress of Charles II. So this is a story I heard again and again from different family members. There can be 2 Walter strands, one German and one English, that eventually connected. So it's just telling you this is a very complex story. That's
Very.
Again, this is Frank on the left. These are his relations, absolutely positively for sure. 3 of these paintings are hanging in a dining room in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. When I went there for the first time and met the family, they're very proud of these oil paintings. And I asked them, you realize that gentleman in the top right-hand corner had to petition for the right to run his family plantation. Oh, no, I didn't know that. Why? I said, because he's Black. And they were quite surprised to learn that. And they've had, the portraits since they were painted in the 1820s. So, it's this very complicated family history. The gentleman with the skull is thought to be most like Frank Walter. He passed away when he was very young because he was performing a medical experiment on himself that involved surgery.
Is he the same man as the one on the right? They look similar. Is that the
No,
same, the man with the skull? No. Okay.
no, that's the only image we know of that gentleman, Dr. Frederick Walter. So he lived in Blackfriars. So so another point of this family was they descend from the worst actor in the history of the British stage, according to Edith Sitwell in her book English Eccentrics, Romeo Coates. And to this day, the family has a property. This family has a tremendous amount of property. And they have a property called Coates's Cottage, where Frank learned woodworking, where they realized when he was little that he was a genius. So they thought, well, we'll have a kind of guild system and we'll train him to do practical things. Frank Walter developed a coat of arms that you can see. It's a very faded photograph with a hole in it. And you can see that one has a bit of the bottom of that painting in the bottom corner. This is the symbol of Coxey Coates, who, if you look at this amusing print, Princely Piety, Coxey Coates is saying his motto, which is cock-a-doodle-doo, while I cock, I crow. So Frank Walter adapted that to a family coat of arms. He created a lot of coats of arms. And again, I just was there to listen to him. He told me he was the Lord of Follies and the Ding-a-Ding Nook and the 7th Prince of the West Indies. Well, I found out the Ding-a-Ding Nook is actually part of the harbor in Rendezvous Bay, where he went sea bathing every day, which is an early family property. I mean, the Walter family owns over 1,000 acres of that land to this day. It's the last private beach in Antigua. Follies was the name of a plantation that they owned, and Frank knew that. So sometimes when people are speaking, this is one of 3 autobiographies he did. This one is 6,283 pages long. And again, there's no typos. He could type to the bottom of a sheet. I'd ask him, how do you do this? And well, don't be ridiculous. I just do it. The words come to me. And it's brilliant. He ran for prime minister against his cousin. His cousin won, but that was his campaign thing. These are just some of the images, just to show people the kind of painting that he did. He had great respect for women. And he had great respect for farmers.
Do you know, Barbara, roughly when these images were made?
They happened mostly between 1968 and 1988. but many pieces are earlier. The sculpture we
and
61 to 88. Frank
and,
wasn't compressed by time. You have to remember, when you talk to Frank, you were in centuries and you were on planets. So we aren't going to make it up, and we just don't always know, because he was very clear about the content. This painting was changing man. That grid was red, black, and yellow because you could change. You could be a black African or a red Arawak or the first people of Antigua or a yellow Chinese. So why is the person blue? And Frank told me when he was on the ship coming from Antigua to England, he turned blue in the process of turning white. And by the time he got to Antigua, he believed he was white. So he's very specific about the content, but the picture on the far right, the upper right corner, is a self-portrait. I would show Frank a portrait of a person of color and ask him if it was a self-portrait, and he'd always say, "Don't be ridiculous, that's a black man." So he's quite consistent on the content, but timing he was in other centuries. This is beautiful.
These amazing images.
Yeah. This is why anybody who hasn't been to the Garden Museum, please go. This is Jeremy Herbert's brilliance. And these are just like gems glowing. They're so beautiful. And there are 1,000 of these. He did 1,000 of these.
Incredible. And they're such amazing images. I mean, these three particularly that you've highlighted here.
If you don't make it to Garden Museum, please go to see Claire's show at the Drawing Center, because she's going to really knock it out of the park with these small images too. They're stunning. They tell you really they tell you everything you need to know about Antigua. Frank didn't really care what you thought. He just wanted you to know what he saw. I mean, he didn't want to offend anyone, but he wasn't there to convince you. That's the famous hurricane of 1950, Hurricane Dog, about which he wrote, oh goodness, 300 pages typed to the bottom of the page. So he talked about the leaves turning inside out, and then you knew the hurricane was coming because the leaves of the trees would all kind of turn inside out. It's beautiful. And the sky would turn this interesting shade of pinkish red.
Yeah, that beautiful sort of red ground showing through there against those greens. There's such a powerful color dynamic happening in those works. And was Frank painting the whole time? I mean, were these things just sort of pouring out of him, or did he work in sort of cycles where he'd paint for a bit and then sculpt, or how
He was
did
always drawing, and he was always painting. Fraser, I think we have to go a little quicker because I want Claire to have time.
Sure.
Yeah, so you just see he always goes from telling you something to abstracting it. Here we are in full-blown abstraction. Hothouse Flowers, Theater and Architecture, the titles. He's very clear about what he was trying to express in this work. And I think for young artists, for people at your Royal Drawing School, he's time traveling. He talks about these cosmic events. He talks about these celestial events. You can see the bottom picture, the Arawak ceremony, the sky, and then look up above, you see it again. The one on the left is the basis of an opera he did, which is about life on Jupiter. Yes, Jupiter. And princesses cruising around in the spacecraft, which you see those two white kind of astral cruisers in the far left-hand column. Those are actually their spacecrafts. Yes, this is Moon Voyage. So again, you see the sculpture, you see the study, and you see the painting. This is a part of his Milky Way Galaxy series, which I think is probably, it's hard to say the most profound, but it's way up there. That's Moon Crater. Again, if you look in the top right-hand corner of that painting, you see landscape paintings that he'd made 50 of these landscape paintings, because this was a place that was very real to him. And it's just so beautiful. Oh yeah, so this is just in our space with, let's see, who's there? Claire, help me. It's Josh Smith.
Is that Josh and Megan?
And then who's the other person? Oh gosh.
Josh, Megan, and is that Josh's friend? Yours?
She's an amazing artist. Yeah, she's an incredible artist. They came and they just didn't want to go. So again, come to the Garden Museum. This is And if you don't make it, well, if you come to the Garden Museum, you still have to go to the Drawing Center. There's jewels. They even made a greenhouse, which was so wonderful, Antiguan plants. And they just, so these were the first people who came and wrote stories about us. Gabrielle Schwartz from the Telegraph, and then Sarah Johnson from the Guardian. And it was just, we hadn't even opened, and they were coming in, and we weren't even quite actually ready, but it was wonderful. The feeling is very good there. One of the other exhibitions we did was about the intangible cultural heritage of Antigua. The early film that Frank appears in, which is the first touristic film in Antigua, talks about seed work, talks about these flip dolls. And so we actually had a separate exhibition about that. And I'm really happy to say that this has become a woman-owned, Black-owned, developing country-owned business called Botanique. And they're going to be in Harewood Hall's first craft biennale from June through November, and then they're going to be going to Ireland. So this exhibition is moving on its own. But
That's
it's
amazing.
yes. And this is the woman, Louise Edwards, is one of the master crafts people working with seed work. So this was the kind of intangible cultural heritage that was very important to Frank Walter to support. And so this is just showing, again, there's just great happiness and joy around all of this work. Okay, so now we're sort of backing up. We're in the pavilion in Venice. Fraser, if you go back one just for a sec. Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, so that's Thelma Golden and then Mark Bradford at our pavilion in Venice in 2017. And again, it was just totally unplugged. And it was about feeling like you were in a garden and just inhabiting the world of the artist. So we can go to the next one. Yeah, this is work we did with, this is the private secretary to the Governor General, learning about, from the Imperatrices of Venice, about the connection between seed work and the intangible cultural heritage of what they do there with antique Murano glass seed beads. So that's sort of how all of this grew, was from our work in 2017. This is just everybody, you can go through these worked, put together the show. It was crazy. That's Jeremy and everybody. You can tell we're just woo. Yeah, we're just having fun. There's James Green from David Sverner, they were incredibly generous, as were the lovely people from Fortis and Deloya in Brazil. They really gave us the funds, along with Hugh Freund, to make this exhibition happen. So yeah, this is just the opening night, which again, it's just been a wonderful thing. So thank you all.
And I think, it seems
sorry, yeah, it's been good.
Such a rich and incredible insight into Frank's world there. Thank you so much for sharing those images with us. And it's such an expansive world, and there's so much to delve into and explore. And I wonder, Claire, sort of thinking about the show which is upcoming, I mean, how did you start to think about preparing for the show?
Yeah, I think I sort of started, the way I start most things, but in the case of this show, it just was a kind of I guess more material to sift through. But I think one always starts with immersing yourself in the artist's work. So that's what I did. And Barbara very kindly invited me to go to Maryland, where much of the work is sort of stored and conserved in a conservation studio there. And so I did a kind of early visit and just looked at hundreds of things, took lots of images on my iPhone, brought them home, kind of sifted through them, digested them, then kind of, cast a lens beyond that. It was worked with some of the galleries who have worked with Frank, and kind of tried to compile for myself my own archive, I guess, of everything Frank that I could find. And then I did 2 other visits actually to Maryland to do follow-up research. And then I had essentially an enormous archive of images on my computer. And I started looking through those and you know, through that process, narrowing down and sort of coming to a sense of what I wanted my show to be. And then I had a sense in my mind, a pretty clear sense of what I wanted to create, what I wanted the exhibition to look like, what mood I wanted it to convey, what aspect of Frank I wanted it to convey. And then I started to map that out in the space and figure out actually, you know, what our space could hold. So I could sort of hone it down to really the specific work. So what I put together for you here, if you want to go back to the first image, I don't remember what it was, but yeah, when we can just scroll through them. But basically, these are our curatorial associate, Izzy Kapoor. Just shout out to Izzy, she's amazing. She sort of helped me with this SketchUp model. And this is really giving you a preview of what the exhibition is going to look like. And you can kind of flash through them. So it's it's in some ways quite different than the Garden Museum show, but I think it does have some relationships to it. But whereas the Garden Museum show, and I think that's wonderful because I really see them as being very complementary, these two shows, and giving you sort of different visions into maybe how Frank himself thought about his work or wanted his work to be seen. So the Garden Museum show, as Barbara was saying, was really an immersive view into how Frank lived with his work, what his studio sort of looked like, what it might feel like to sort of be there with Frank and his work. And my show, I feel like, is sort of envisioning what Frank himself wrote at one point or said at what point, you know, how he would like his work to be seen, which he said, you know, I'm envisioning a show. I mean, which is it's not nothing unusual, but I think it might have been slightly unusual for him because I don't think he he had the opportunity to see his work this way, which was to say, you know, I want to see my work framed on the walls, you know, and then to see sculptures and other materials, or I've interpreted to other materials in the interior of the space. So that is in a sense what I've done is given. So I'm really creating kind of an exhibition within an exhibition, and I don't know if you can see that if you keep going through. Maybe you'll get to some of those views where you can start to see a kind of wider view where you can see the interior and how we've divided it up with vitrines. I'm sort of waiting for that. Keep going. Maybe we'll get that at some point.
It's
so you
so
can sort
great
of start to see these are more narrow views, but there probably is a wider view coming up at some point. But I think what I decided to do, here's sort of, you can start to get a sense of a wider view, and maybe keep going. I'm just curious what whether we have, no, we don't. Okay. So basically, what I also had a sense of, you know, what mood I wanted to create on the walls. So on the walls, I wanted to create a more expansive space, right, where one could sort of get lost in the drawings, appreciate the drawings on their own terms, and in a way, not necessarily be in Frank's head, right, or in Frank's space. Because I think one of the beautiful things about Frank's work for me is that, you know, he is always looking, right? Everything that he gives us is seen from a perspective, right? You always get the sense that it is the world viewed, but it's not necessarily the world viewed by him in some sort of personal way, right? In a way, I feel like he's so generous to the point that he's saying, I am giving you the world viewed, but I'm taking myself out of this too. This is to deliver to you, like sort of what Barbara said, what I see, but it's not my psychology, you know, that's involved in this. And so that's what I wanted to give that impression of on the outer walls. And then very specifically, the show is taking you through what something that Barbara also touched on, which was this move from abstraction into specificity and back out into abstraction. And I think that this is also absolutely essential for everything that Frank does, because he was a careful observer of the world, but he also understood, and I think that this is implicit in almost every work that he does, that observation is it's imperfect, right? You can never perfectly capture the world. Only God, in a sense, can sort of perfectly capture or perfectly comprehend. And he was actually a very religious person. And I think that, you know, that idea is implicit in everything he does. So there's an attempt to show what you see, but there's also this awareness that there's something elusive, right? There's something beyond what we see, something that he actually did name, which was the fourth dimension, and something that he actually explored visually in his abstract work. So each wall, in a way, starts from an abstract place. If you want to go back to the very first slide, you can see, okay, so that next slide is a good place. The next one. Yes, this one. So you can see here where you're moving from this place of near abstraction in these seascapes on the small wall. And then you're moving from that, and then you're moving closer and closer and closer in a certain sense, moving from a view of a beach to a view of sort of closer into this bird to very, very, very close image of this white egret. And then moving into these drawings where you're seeing these, if you want to go back, sorry, into these individual animals, individual figures, individual characters. So moving from a kind of faraway scene to a closer up scene to the individual fragments. And I think that he was, in a way, composing the world out of these fragments in a certain sense, and understanding that life is built up of these individual pieces, and we can't really encapsulate it as a whole. Hence, I think also his tendency to make, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of images, right? That, you know, there was no stopping point for him. There was no resolution. There was no single rendition. There was this very faithful effort to depict the world, and also to understand that that world was something whose beauty and majesty was outside of anything he could ever capture. On the interior of the space, and I guess we don't really have many views of that, but you saw on that one slide, there's going to be lots of vitrines, and there's also going to be a center wall, which Barbara has termed, and I've accepted that terminology, the beautiful mind wall, after John Nash at the Institute for Advanced Study. And on that wall is going to be just like a kind of compilation of many, 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 many manuscripts, or different kinds of items, different kinds of materials that Frank made. So on that wall and in the vitrines, you will get that sense more of Frank's mind and Frank's self, and how Frank inhabited in the midst, lived in the midst of this work in a certain sense. So in a way, it will be a kind of exhibition within an exhibition in a certain sense. And then if you go into the second set of slides, I can talk a little bit about Josh Smith's contribution to the show. So Josh, many of you probably know, is an incredible artist, contemporary artist, who has actually shows, interestingly, with two of the galleries that have showed Frank's work. So he shows with David Zwirner, who has done exhibitions of Frank's work, and Josh also shows with Xavier Hufkins, who had an exhibition of Frank's work. So Josh was introduced to Frank's work during, I think, he was actually having a show at Xavier Hufkins at the same time that Frank's work was being shown there. And like many of us, he had this just, kind of revelatory encounter with Frank. I think had not seen his work before, and just was, who is this? What is this? I need to know more about this. And Barbara, recognizing a fellow Frank enthusiast, took, very generously brought Josh into Frank's world, and sent, I think, Josh some materials about Frank, some of his recordings, some more of his images. Josh is someone that we at the Drawing Center have known for a long time. And when we learned about Josh's enthusiasm for Frank, we thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to do a sort of parallel exhibition of Josh's work at the same time as Frank's work that we are thinking of as Josh's, and we can maybe rest here for a minute, of Josh's homage to Frank in a certain sense. And there are many reasons why I wanted to do this. I think one thing we haven't touched on is how important Frank is to artists and to contemporary artists. I think actually creatives of all kinds respond to Frank's work, because I think there is this honesty to his work and this drive for authenticity, this drive to sort of present the real in some way that appeals to artists and creators. And I wanted to sort of have that aspect of Frank be a part of the show. So I invited Josh to do this project at the same time. I've also invited some collaborators into the catalog. We have an absolutely extraordinary collaboration by the poet, St. Lucian poet, Vladimir Lucian. He wrote some new poems in response to Frank's work, which are just absolutely extraordinary. The painter, British painter, Lynette Yedamwache is also going to contribute something to the catalog. So I wanted the show to be an opportunity, not just to have Frank sort of sitting in the past, but to allow Frank to speak to show how Frank is speaking to the present moment. And so I thought bringing Josh in would be a great way. We are showing drawings by Josh that actually have never been seen. Josh has never really shown his drawings at all. We have 3 prints in this show. He is known for prints, and paintings, but otherwise it's all drawings, and they're drawings from all stages of Josh's career, that mostly animals, also some faces, also some sailboats, city scenes, things that were inspired in a way by palm trees also. So some subjects that actually were shared by Frank and Josh, but also just that attempt to sort of capture something of truth, something of the real world through through kind of that attempt to do something over and over and over again, to sort of capture some sort of reality that is both based in truth and in fantasy in a certain sense. And I think that that's something that Frank and Josh share, that sense that truth is always also partaking of fantasy. So yeah, so that's my kind of brief introduction to the show at the Drawing Center and to the Josh Smith shows, which will be opening on June 20th and run through September 15th. So I do hope that people over in the UK and elsewhere will be able to come and see them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop there. I mean, it seems like such an incredible project to work on. And I think, so much of what we do at the school is introducing our own artists to the work of other artists and seeing how they respond. And that dialogue, especially through drawing, is such an interesting one. So it's really interesting to hear about Josh's work and that response, and how that in turn brings a new audience to Frank's work as well. And thanks to you, Barbara, for sharing your experiences. I don't know if you're still there, if your video disappeared, but maybe. And for sharing that.
No, I'm still here. It's just the light was sort of too sharp, and I felt like it wasn't nice. So yes, thank you for letting us speak about it. And I think that one of the things, Claire, I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about, I didn't want to steal that, was about how Frank Walter is the artist's artist, because I think that would be, particularly coming from you, really interesting to the audience tonight.
Right. I mean, well, that's what I was saying with the introduction of, the invitation to have Josh participate in the show, and to also show, and also to invite some other artists to participate, not just visual artists, but also inviting Vladimir Lucian, who I believe, I would also think of as an artist in that sense. But I think, I was speaking with Josh about that, what that means to be an artist's artist. And I think he was, I think it means more than just the fact that artists admire you, that other, but which is a huge part of it. I mean, I guess that's essentially what it means, but why is it that other artists particularly admire certain artists? And so we were talking about that. And I think we were agreeing it does have to do with this, a certain authenticity, I think. This sense of, no kind of pretense there, or not an attempt to kind of, not being motivated by external concerns, or not being motivated by some sort of agenda or some sort of goal that they're trying to, achieve, but really just being motivated by the desire to depict something real, whatever that means, whatever you think of as being real. I think for Frank, the real meant an awareness that the world is depicted, it's observation plus imagination together, right? I think that's for him what you see in all of his works, those two things together. And I think that that's also for Josh, it's observation plus imagination. And maybe that itself is what is kind of like the epitome of art, right? Of like that it's those two things that come together in a really authentic way. So I think that's what people are responding to, but I don't know if you have other thoughts, Barbara.
Well, we talked a lot about two things. One is the number of artists who have been attracted to Frank Walter's work and actually collected it is something
right.
featuring in her show, right?
Yeah.
So
yes, that's true. That's a good point. I did want to cast, I got very interested in who was collecting Frank's work. And in a way I wanted to feature that. So because I think it actually says a lot about him. So we are borrowing works from a number of artists and who have been so generous in lending work. But I think that itself says something, as Barbara's saying, these major figures who are, who are personally collecting Frank's work.
Yeah, and then I think that the second part of that is that Frank, we talked to him a lot about, okay, so you never had an exhibition, but why are your paintings all numbered on the back, box 223, number 56? And he planned an exhibition. And he wrote to the coal mining board in Northern England saying, I was a coal miner in England. I have a lot of respect for my fellow miners, and I'd like to have an exhibition in your coal mine. And he wanted to show all 5,000 paintings. And he did the same thing in Germany. And he also wrote to cruise ship liners saying that he wanted to have these exhibitions. And so we always thought that that must have been very disappointing for him, but he never expressed that. He just said that he wanted his art, and Claire has really nailed it, because he wanted the art to be on the walls. He never talked about himself. It was about how the art would cure more than any opiate could draw. So he ultimately saw his art as being therapeutic and helpful to other people. And he talked about how people would see his work on the wall and there would be sculpture in the middle and archival work that you would kind of move around as you experience the space. So it was always about the impact that the art would have on others in a positive way.
Yeah.
I think her exhibition is going to nail those two things.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear, Barbara, and you, Claire, speaking about the way that artists are drawn to Frank's work. And I think you used the word honesty at one point. And, here is someone sort of making work away from all the mechanics of the sort of contemporary art world. And I think, that must be an appeal to contemporary artists, right? Where you so often feel that you have to form some sort of brand, and here is a man who just lived in a place and seemed to sort of collect life and return it. It was interesting hearing you just then, Barbara, talking about opportunities that Frank sought out to show his work. And I wondered what his personal relationship was to those kind of mechanics of the art world, in inverted commas, and the things that were happening elsewhere, and whether he was sort of happy to remain separate from that, or if he was actively trying to understand his own place in that world, and how important it was for him that his work be seen.
It was his anodyne. Art was ultimately his form of therapy for him. He had no choice but to do art. And everywhere he went, he was very powerful at this. When he was in Dominica, on the island of Dominica from 1961 to 68, they told me he was a supernatural. And they said sometimes it made them very uncomfortable when he drew people because he was drawing their soul. I mean, he had zero off switch wherever he went. And again, he was very engaged with the art world on his terms. He lived in libraries, he lived in art galleries and public gardens when he was in England from 1953 to 1960. He lived in churches, and he did this primarily to keep warm and to feed his brain. But he had incredibly privileged early education at the Antiguan Grammar School. And there actually was a drawing academy in England, in Antigua, courtesy of Lord Baldwin, who was the governor to the Leeward Islands from 1948 through 1950. And Frank had studied in that academy, and they received certificates from the Brompton School when they completed the course. So they were quite, when people describe Frank Walter as a sort of self-educated person, I don't know what they're talking about. He was highly, highly educated, had a much more privileged early education than I had.
Thank you. And I think if you're both happy, we do have some questions coming in. So we do have a few minutes now, and if you're happy to answer some of those, I'm just going to read a few out. And thank you to Charmin, who has dropped a kind note saying that the Garden Museum's open until 8:30 p.m. on the 23rd. So extended opening on that day if anyone does want to go along. And I just wheel back to a question from one of our students who says, if I understand correctly, Walter was responding to the world around him and his life was very close to nature, and wondered, Barbara, about your conversations with him and his influences alongside nature and moments in his life. So in particular, spiritual beliefs or connection to history.
That is an amazing question.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to call him St. Francis of Antigua. So I was trained very early as a landscape architect before I studied art history. And I love plants. He could talk about any plant anywhere on planet Earth. He was going to tell you everything about it on a molecular cellular level, and he understood life systems. He was very comfortable living close to nature. And again, I realized, that I had to hit every reset button when I met him, because everything I thought I knew about landscape architecture was wrong. This was a person, he didn't listen to leaf blowers. He didn't have door locks on his doors. He didn't have fences. He walked to his own beach every day and swam in the sea, the seawater. He ate what he grew. He collected water from his roof. This was someone who was really understood life and was deeply privileged and very happy. And as Josh was just blown away, because he said Frank Walter's studio begins when you enter his kind of property, when you enter the exterior world. Frank's art studio was a concrete platform. There were no walls. There was no ceiling. And when asked about that, he said, look at this view. Why do I need to pen myself in? Why would I do that? And he was right. When a team of neurosurgeons at New York Hospital for the Biennale, I asked them to look at his 50,000-page archive and give me a diagnosis, because there were some terms given to Frank that I didn't agree with. And I am in no way trained or qualified to medically diagnose a human being. And one of the neurosurgeons wrote a very beautiful, I think it's a 3-page essay in our Biennale catalog, where she stated, this man did not suffer from madness, he suffered from genius. And had he been in America, he would have been medicated, institutionalized, and incapable of pursuing his dream as an artist. And that was, again, thanks to him knowing where he needed to be, and thanks to his family who made it possible. Right, Claire?
Yeah, because I mean, he does refer to schizophrenia. He does write about that in his autobiography, which
And
was
I would ask
interesting.
him, do you have schizophrenia? He said, no, I
Right,
don't have two. Don't be ridiculous. I don't have two personalities. I have three. And he would describe them.
right,
So every
right. And because so in some ways he knew that he operated on a different level, I guess, than most of us. But he understood those things as giving him great privilege and access to other forms of experience in a certain sense, I guess. So he writes about, yeah, I mean, he writes about, at one point he writes about hearing other voices and seeing other, but not in a way that he's troubled by it, right? He seems very, very at peace with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that answers one of the other questions which referred to that troubled mind, or reference to a troubled mind. And I think that ties that together nicely. I fear we may have to bring the evening to a close there. I just want to say both thank you so much for joining us tonight. I mean, it's been incredible to hear and explore Frank's life through your deep personal connection with him, Barbara. Those fantastic images, and I think they were so well placed to show us that life and how expansive it was. And I really do hope that, although there are only a few days left, some of you will be able to get to the Garden Museum and see that incredible show. And then thank you to you, Claire, for sharing your experience of being involved in Frank's work and the process of putting together your own special exhibition. It was wonderful to see those drawings.
Thank you so much. No, it's a privilege to be working with Frank's work. Yeah.
Yeah. And I hope if any of you are able to go to the Drawing Centre in June to see the show, that you absolutely will make it a priority. So thank you very much indeed, both of you. It's been wonderful having you with us. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Fraser. Thank you, Barbara. Bye.
Bye.